The year was 1867. For the first time in Mississippi's history, black men walked to polling places as voters. They registered by the thousands. They elected representatives to state legislatures. In Mississippi alone, where black people comprised the majority of the population, they sent 5 black senators and 30 black representatives to the state legislature in 1870. African Americans made up the majority of registered voters. This was democracy in action. This was Reconstruction. But by 1892, less than 25 years later, that same state had reduced black voter registration from over 90% to under 6%. In Louisiana, the transformation was even more brutal. In 1896, the state had 130,000 registered black voters. By 1900, that number had collapsed to just 5,320. By 1904, only 1,000 black voters remained on the rolls in a state with 650 to 104 black residents. This wasn't gradual decline. This wasn't coincidence. This was systematic erasure. Between the 1890s and early 1900s, Southern white lawmakers engineered one of the most effective campaigns of political destruction in American history. They didn't just reduce black voting, they eliminated it. And they did it using laws that looked neutral on paper, but were designed with surgical precision to exclude almost every black voter while allowing poor white voters to pass through loopholes. The tools they used had names that sound bureaucratic and boring: poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, property requirements, grandfather clauses. But make no mistake, these weren't administrative procedures. They were weapons. And behind them stood violence, intimidation, and the constant threat of death. This is the story of how democracy was systematically dismantled in the American South. It's a story that lasted more than 60 years, and it began with a constitutional convention in Mississippi in 1890. Mississippi led the way. When white Democrats gathered for their constitutional convention in November 1890, they weren't shy about their intentions. The convention president said it plainly, "We came here to exclude the Negro." But they had a problem. The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1870, explicitly prohibited states from denying the vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So they couldn't just write, "Black people can't vote" into their Constitution. They had to be more clever. They had to create barriers that appeared race-neutral but functioned with devastating effectiveness against black voters. The Mississippi Plan, as it came to be known, was a masterpiece of discriminatory engineering. First came the poll tax. Voters had to pay a fee, usually $1 to $2, which had to be paid months before the election. This doesn't sound like much until you understand that $2 in 1890 would be equivalent to about $70 today. For sharecroppers and agricultural workers, who often didn't handle cash and were paid at harvest time, this was an impossible burden. Many black Mississippians made less than $200 per year. The poll tax alone eliminated huge numbers of voters. But the poll tax was just the opening move. The real devastation came from the literacy test and the understanding clause. Here's how it worked. To register to vote, you had to appear before a county clerk, who was always white. The clerk would hand you a section of the state constitution and ask you to read it and explain it to his satisfaction. Now, if you were black, the clerk would select the most complex technical passage he could find. Arcane legal language about taxation powers or jurisdictional boundaries. Dense paragraphs that even lawyers would struggle to interpret, and you had to read it aloud without error and then explain what it meant. If the clerk decided you didn't understand it well enough, you failed. If you stumbled over a single word, you failed. The clerk had complete, unchecked discretion. The cruelty was in the details. A black teacher with a college education could be told he failed to adequately explain Article 4, Section 7 of the Mississippi Constitution. A black property owner who could read fluently could be rejected because the clerk decided his interpretation wasn't satisfactory. It didn't matter how educated you were. It didn't matter if you'd been voting for years. The test was designed so that any black citizen could be failed at the clerk's whim. But here's what made the system truly diabolical. If you couldn't read the Constitution, you could still qualify by demonstrating that you could understand it when it was read to you. This was the understanding clause. The clerk would read a section aloud and ask you to explain it. For white voters, especially poor white voters who might not be able to read, the clerk would pick simple sentences. The governor serves a 4-year term. Explain that, and you're registered. For black applicants, the clerk would read complex constitutional provisions and demand detailed legal interpretations. It was a test designed to pass whites and fail blacks. One white Mississippi registrar bragged about the system's effectiveness. He selected passages that, in his words, few white men and no black people could explain. Another official described the sections of the Constitution as having been crafted with Byzantine complexity, specifically to create this two-tier system. Senator James Zachariah George, called the father of the 1890 Mississippi Constitution, openly celebrated that the document had been engineered to disenfranchise black voters. And then there was the grandfather clause, the ultimate escape hatch for white voters. This provision, first implemented in Louisiana in 1898, allowed anyone to vote if their grandfather had been eligible to vote on January 1st, 1867. Notice that date. January 1st, 1867 was before the 15th Amendment. It was before black men had the right to vote. So if your grandfather could vote in 1867, you were automatically registered, regardless of whether you could read, regardless of whether you could pay the poll tax. This loophole captured virtually every white man in the South. But for black citizens whose grandfathers had been enslaved or otherwise barred from voting, the grandfather clause offered nothing. The system was elegant in its cruelty. Poor, illiterate white voters could bypass the literacy test through the grandfather clause. Black citizens, no matter how educated or wealthy, faced the full weight of discriminatory enforcement. A white man who couldn't write his own name could be ushered through registration. A black school teacher with a master's degree could be turned away. The results were catastrophic. In Mississippi, black voter registration collapsed from more than 90% during Reconstruction to less than 6% by 1892. In Alabama, after the state adopted a new constitution in 1901, census data showed that 121,159 black men were literate, but only 3,742 were registered to vote. Think about that. More than 117,000 literate black men were denied the right to vote. Louisiana's experience was even more stark. When the state adopted its new constitution in May 1898, complete with poll taxes, literacy tests, property requirements, and the grandfather clause, the impact was immediate. Black voter registration plummeted from 130,000 to 5,020 in just 2 years. By 1904, only 1,000 black voters remained registered in the entire state. In a single county, with a population of about 8,000 whites and 11,700 black citizens, only 25 to 30 qualified black voters remained by 1908. Another county, with 30,000 black residents, had only about 175 registered black voters. State after state followed Mississippi's lead. South Carolina held a constitutional convention in 1895. The Charleston News and Courier urged delegates to support whatever extreme measures were necessary to reduce the colored vote to insignificance in every county in the state. They succeeded. North Carolina amended its constitution in 1900. In 1896, there were 125,000 registered black voters in North Carolina. By 1902, there were only 6,000. Alabama adopted its new constitution in 1901. Virginia followed in 1902. Georgia completed its disenfranchising constitution in 1908. By 1910, every state in the former Confederacy had rewritten its constitution or passed laws specifically designed to eliminate black voters. And the methods were remarkably similar. Poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, grandfather clauses, moral character requirements, property qualifications, arbitrary registration rules. Each state created its own maze, but they all led to the same destination, the complete exclusion of black citizens from political power. The statistics tell the story of a political apocalypse. By 1910, registered voters among African Americans had dropped to 15% in Virginia and under 2% in both Alabama and Mississippi. Across the entire South, black voting declined by 62% between 1890 and 1900. White voting also declined by 26% because the restrictions caught some poor whites too. But the laws primarily devastated black communities, and that was exactly the intent. In 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court had the opportunity to strike down this systematic disenfranchisement. A black man named Henry Williams had been convicted of murder by an all-white jury in Mississippi. He challenged his conviction on the grounds that the jury selection was tainted because Mississippi's voting laws discriminated against black citizens, who were therefore excluded from jury service. The case, Williams v. Mississippi, reached the Supreme Court. The court's decision was unanimous and devastating. Writing for the court, Justice Joseph McKenna acknowledged that Mississippi's Constitution didn't discriminate on their face between the races. He admitted that evil was possible under them. But because the laws didn't explicitly mention race, and because Williams hadn't proven that their actual administration was evil, the court upheld Mississippi's voting restrictions. This ruling gave every other southern state a green light. If Mississippi could get away with it, so could they. But the laws were only part of the system. Behind every literacy test, behind every clerk's office, stood the threat of violence. Black citizens who attempted to register faced intimidation, economic reprisal, and physical danger. Employers threatened to fire black workers who tried to vote. Landlords threatened eviction. Creditors threatened to call in loans. White registrars hurled verbal abuse at black applicants. And for those who persisted, there was the ever-present threat of mob violence. Lynching became a tool of voter suppression. From the 1890s through the 1920s, lynchings reached epidemic proportions in the American South. Between 1882 and 1930, more than 3,000 African Americans were murdered by lynch mobs. Georgia recorded 458 lynchings. Mississippi recorded 538. These weren't random acts of violence. Research shows that lynchings increased near election times, particularly in areas where the Democratic Party faced political challenges. Lynchings were more likely after elections where Democrats performed poorly. The message was clear. Black political participation would be met with death. The violence was organized and systematic. In Louisiana, the Carolinas, and Florida, the Democratic Party relied on paramilitary groups like the White League and the Red Shirts to terrorize black voters. These groups disrupted Republican rallies, intimidated black citizens with threats of violence, and assassinated black leaders. In 1868, white Democrats in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, terrorized the local black community in 2 weeks of attacks that left more than 100 black people dead. In 1873, after a close gubernatorial election, a militia of white Democrats killed dozens of black Republicans in what became known as the Colfax Massacre. This was political terrorism, and it was devastatingly effective. A black citizen approaching a courthouse to register knew he was risking his life. He knew that registering to vote could mean losing his job, his home, or his life. For many, the risk was simply too great. And that was precisely the calculation white lawmakers wanted black citizens to make. By the early 1900s, black political power in the South had been effectively eliminated. Following African-American George H. White's term representing North Carolina, which ended in 1901, only a handful of black men were elected to federal office until 1958. And those few were elected in northern states like Illinois, New York, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The South had become a one-party region, dominated by white Democrats who held power through violence and legal manipulation. The impact went far beyond voting, because jury service was restricted to registered voters. Black citizens were excluded from juries. This meant that black defendants faced all-white juries in a legal system designed to maintain white supremacy. It meant that crimes against black victims went unpunished, because white juries refused to convict white defendants. The exclusion from voting created a cascade of injustices throughout Southern society. The disenfranchisement also shaped the entire political structure of the United States for generations. Southern Democrats, secure in their one-party control, built seniority in Congress. They dominated committee chairmanships. They blocked civil rights legislation. They rejected anti-lynching bills. Even as lynchings continued year after year, they opposed labor protections, federal education funding, and health care expansions because those policies would benefit black citizens. The elimination of black voting power in the South meant that white Southern Democrats could exercise power far beyond their states, blocking progressive legislation at the federal level. The system was so effective that it lasted for more than 60 years. Generations of African Americans grew up never seeing a black person vote. Children born in 1900 in Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana could reach middle age without ever seeing meaningful black political participation. The entire political infrastructure of the South was built on exclusion, and it became normalized, accepted, treated as simply the way things were. There were attempts at resistance. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, fought voter suppression through litigation. They challenged white primaries, discriminatory registration practices, and other barriers. In 1915, the Supreme Court finally struck down grandfather clauses in Ginn versus United States, but Southern states simply switched to other methods. When one discriminatory device was outlawed, they invented another. Oklahoma, for example, created a new registration system that gave existing voters permanent registration but required new voters to register during a narrow 12-day window or be permanently barred. The creativity of suppression seemed endless. The white primary became another powerful tool of exclusion. Southern states declared that political parties were private organizations, not government entities. Therefore, the 15th Amendment didn't apply to party primaries. The Democratic Party across the South excluded black citizens from membership and from voting in primary elections. Since the South was overwhelmingly Democratic, winning the primary meant winning the general election. By excluding black voters from primaries, Southern states effectively eliminated their political voice, even when small numbers managed to register. It wasn't until 1944, in Smith v. Allwright, that the Supreme Court finally struck down white primaries. But by then, the damage was comprehensive. Throughout this entire period, violence remained a constant. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. Lynch mobs operated with impunity. Between 1890 and 1900, Georgia averaged more than one mob killing per month. Photographs of lynching circulated as postcards. Newspapers published detailed accounts, sometimes in advance, inviting white citizens to attend. The spectacle of racial terrorism was designed to send a message. White supremacy would be maintained at any cost. The federal government largely stood by. Congress failed to pass anti-lynching legislation despite repeated attempts. The first federal anti-lynching bill received only 3 votes in Congress in 1900. Subsequent bills in 1935 and later years were blocked by Southern senators. Presidents from both parties showed little interest in challenging Southern states' control over voting. The Justice Department, even when it wanted to act, had limited tools. Court cases moved slowly, and Southern states simply changed tactics when one method was blocked. The Great Migration, which began around 1916, saw millions of African Americans flee the South for northern and western cities. They were escaping not just economic oppression and Jim Crow segregation, but also political exclusion. In northern cities, black citizens could vote, and they began to build political power. Black communities in Chicago, New York, Detroit, and other cities became influential voting blocs. But in the South, the system of disenfranchisement remained locked in place. World War II brought new attention to racial injustice. Black soldiers who had fought for democracy abroad returned home to states where they couldn't vote. The contradiction was stark and impossible to ignore. Civil rights organizations intensified their campaigns. The NAACP won important court victories, but Southern states continued to resist. When courts struck down literacy tests, states imposed new administrative hurdles. When grandfather clauses were banned, states created arbitrary registration systems. The determination to prevent black voting seemed inexhaustible. By the 1960s, the system was still firmly in place. In Mississippi in 1964, almost 70 years after the disenfranchisement began, only 6.7% of voting-age black citizens were registered to vote. In Alabama, only 90.4% were registered. Dallas County, Alabama, where the city of Selma is located, had a majority black population, but of 9,177 registered voters, only 335 were black. In the previous 2 years, only 93 of 795 black applicants had been allowed to register, while 745 of 1,232 white applicants were accepted. The breaking point came in Selma in March 1965. Civil rights activists, led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, organized a march from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights. On March 7th, as marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Alabama state troopers attacked them with clubs and tear gas. The images of Bloody Sunday were broadcast across the nation and around the world. The brutality shocked the American conscience. President Lyndon Johnson, who had been reluctant to push voting rights legislation, was galvanized. He addressed Congress on March 15th, calling for comprehensive voting rights legislation. On August 6, 1965, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The act was revolutionary in its approach. It banned literacy tests nationwide. It authorized federal examiners to oversee voter registration in jurisdictions with histories of discrimination. Most importantly, it included Section 5, which required certain states and jurisdictions to get federal approval before changing any voting procedures. This pre-clearance requirement meant that Southern states couldn't simply invent new barriers when old ones were struck down. The impact was immediate and dramatic. By the end of 1965, 250,000 new black voters had been registered, one-third by federal examiners. By 1967, black voter registration across the South had surged. In Mississippi, registration jumped from 6.7% in 1964 to 59.4% in 1968. In Alabama, it rose from 23% to 56.7%. In Louisiana, it climbed to 7.3 percentage points. In Georgia, it increased by 25.2 percentage points. States that had spent 70 years perfecting the art of exclusion saw their systems dismantled in a matter of months. The Voting Rights Act didn't just change registration numbers. It transformed Southern politics. Black candidates began winning elections to local offices, state legislatures, and Congress. In communities that hadn't seen a black elected official since Reconstruction, African Americans began serving as mayors, county commissioners, and school board members. By 1980, there were 6,140 black elected officials in local governments across the South, compared to just 1,470 in 1962. Political power that had been stolen in the 1890s was finally being restored in the 1960s and 1970s. But the story doesn't end there. The Voting Rights Act has been challenged repeatedly. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the coverage formula for Section 5 in Shelby County boroughs holder, effectively ending pre-clearance for most jurisdictions. Within hours of that decision, Texas announced it would implement a strict voter ID law that had previously been blocked. Other states followed with new voting restrictions. The tools have changed, but the goal of limiting black political power persists. What happened between the 1890s and 1965 was not an accident of history. It was not a gradual drift toward injustice. It was deliberate, systematic, and brutally effective. White Southern lawmakers set out to eliminate black voting, and they succeeded. They created laws that looked neutral but functioned with devastating precision. They backed those laws with violence and terror. They defended their system in courts that sided with them, and they maintained it for more than 60 years. The numbers are stark. Louisiana, from 130,000 registered black voters to 1,000 in 14 years. Mississippi, from over 90% black voter registration to under 6% in 2 years. North Carolina, from 125,000 registered black voters to 6,000 in 6 years. These weren't abstract statistics. They represented hundreds of thousands of people who were shut out of democracy. They represented political power stolen. They represented a theft of citizenship that shaped American politics for generations. Understanding this history is essential because the mechanisms of voter suppression evolved but never disappeared. Poll taxes gave way to voter ID laws. Literacy tests became complicated registration requirements. White primaries became at-large elections that dilute black voting power. The tools change, but the fundamental struggle remains. Who gets to participate in democracy and who gets to decide? The systematic erasure of black voting rights in the South stands as one of the most successful campaigns of political suppression in modern history. It took a century of resistance, from Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Movement, to even partially undo what was accomplished in just 2 decades at the turn of the 20th century, and even today, more than 50 years after the Voting Rights Act, the fight to protect voting rights continues. This is the story of how democracy died in the American South, not through invasion or revolution, but through constitutional conventions and literacy tests, not overnight, but systematically, state by state, law by law. And it's a reminder that voting rights are never secure, that democracy requires constant vigilance, and that what can be built can also be destroyed. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.